that you're all here, and I'll just take 1 minute and introduce myself, and then I'll turn it over to Cecil, and he can introduce himself as well. But my name is Adam Frower, and I work predominantly with Elliot and the Solution Focused Universe, and I'm the director of research and training there, and so it's great. I get to do whatever kind of research I want, and this is part of the research that I like to do. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Cecil and I have known each other, I don't know how long, like 6 or 7 years, something. I don't know.
Half my life at this point.
Cecil's 10 years old, so it's not been long.
Close enough.
Yeah, but anyway, we're glad you're here. Cecil, what do you want to say about yourself?
I think you gave me a decent introduction already. I work in private practice here in Atlanta. Adam and I both are in Atlanta, and I also obviously do some research with Adam and some stuff with the Solution Focused Universe.
Perfect. Well, wonderful. Well, we're just going to jump in. The plan, just so you know, is we have some slides that we're going to cover. We are going to talk about one research study that we've done and worked on. We'll give you a little bit of background information so that you can understand it. And then we'll go over the results of the study. And then we'll leave some time at the end, hopefully, for some questions and answers so that you can ask whatever it is you need to. All right. So we're going to talk about presuppositions. And I guess I'll give you one other kind of just heads up about this process, is that later on you'll see we used, when we started this project, this was not necessarily the intention, but then it became the intention as we went on. But if you are not familiar with Mark McCurgo's paper from 2016 about a comparison between solution focused brief therapy 1.0 versus 2.0, then that's something that you'll probably want to go look at and investigate a little bit, because we used then that paper as a premise for this study to see if we could find empirical evidence to show that what he was talking about was true or not. And so we'll show some of those results as well. So again, if you're not familiar with that paper, you'll probably want to go get familiar with that paper. So, all right, so I'll turn it over to Cecil. He's going to start us out.
Thanks. So what we were looking at with our study was basically just trying to learn more about presuppositions and just trying to observe them and how they take their shape in sessions. And so we were comparing, we looked very closely at sessions from some of the original clinicians of Solution Focus, like Steve DeShazer, and then we also looked at some more recent clinicians like Elliot and Chris from Brief. And so I guess it's worth trying to answer first off what a presupposition is. A presuppositional question is a question that has some presumptions kind of built into the question itself. And so by asking the question, there's already something being assumed. And I think you could go on to say that by answering the question, you're confirming whatever is assumed as well. Since we were looking at presuppositions, we started noticing that they started to have different functions or show up in different ways. And so that led us to kind of delineate them into different types of presuppositions based on how they were used or what was kind of showing up linguistically. I think you can go to the next slide. Do you have anything to add just in general, starting off, Adam?
Nope, I think you did a wonderful job.
So the first type is what we called a directing presuppositional question. And the most simplest definition is it's one that does not have any of the client's exact language in it, or it doesn't have a deictic reference being some way of referring to exact language that the client has used previously. The example we included, the therapist says, "What are your best hopes from our talking?" And the client says, "I haven't really been told that much." So, and in that presuppositional question. It's directing because this would obviously be at the beginning of the conversation. I believe this was taken from exactly from one of our transcripts. And it's a presupposition because it's assuming that the client has brought some hopes for the conversation in the first place. I think you could even go on to say it's assuming that the client could pick what the best, the most superlative of those hopes were from the conversation. Some of the assumptions I think can be very subtle like that, but either way, they're still presuppositions. This is very different than what I believe will be the next one, which is a continuous presupposition, which does use the client's language. And the difference that makes is it, as it kind of says, continues in the direction that the client was kind of setting up by whatever it was that they were describing or the words that they were using, as opposed to the directing presupposition, which I think is kind of gives us a glimpse of those moments where the clinician is doing a bit of nudging the client in a certain direction. So asking about best hopes, that's kind of nudging us off in that direction already for the conversation, rather than whatever the client would have, whatever direction the client would have taken the conversation in. So as I said before, a continuous presuppositional question uses either the client's exact language or a distinct reference, again, something referring to language that the client's used before. The example here is the client says, "I'm into cars," and that sort of stuff. I buy them and sell them. And the therapist says, "What kind of cars are you most interested in buying and selling?" It's just simply put, the therapist is using the client's exact language, and therefore continuing, though it's a presupposition that comes with some presumption in it, it's continuing in the direction of what the client was saying. The presupposition there, what it's assuming is, again, that the client can name the things that he is most interested in buying and selling, that he can pick out the most of those superlatives like that are really common in presuppositions, at least in how we've noticed we've been using them in solution focus. Next one.
Can I just add one thing? So I just, as you were talking, I wanted to just reference one thing, and it was these titles, these types of presuppositions, these are things that we named. So in a microanalysis, these are microanalysis is very much an inductive process. So what you're looking for and what you discover, it occurs as you're looking. So we didn't necessarily go into it saying, we want to know about directing presuppositions or continuous presuppositions. We just said, let's look at presuppositions and discover what we can discover about them. And then we applied words to describe what we were finding. So directing presuppositions is a term that we utilize just to make sense of what we were seeing. And continuous presuppositions, again, that's just a title that we are using to describe what we were seeing. So if you go do a Google search for directing presuppositions, you probably won't find it because we just made it up. And it, again, in the microanalysis, it's a way for us to describe what we're noticing as we're watching this.
The next type that we categorized was a redirecting presuppositional question. And I think it's a pretty straightforward and familiar seeming one. It's one where you're just kind of providing or asking about an alternative to what the client has said, usually something negative or a bit not in the direction that a solution-focused conversation might tend to go. And the most common uses are something like, what would you rather have instead, or something like that. The example we had here, what would you be doing instead of using drugs? So like I said, it just kind of redirects the direction that the conversation was going, rather than continuing on using their language and going in that direction, because obviously that wouldn't be very solution focused if we started talking about, the bad stuff and the joys of doing the bad stuff and all of that. Yeah, I think next slide is one more. And conditional presuppositional questions. This one I think was very common because we started noticing that there were always these extra phrases added on to the presuppositions that kind of made them more specific. And so it was conditional when it had a specific kind of hypothetical or imagined scenario, something surrounding the question. A lot of times it came from the client. They would talk about, if they had such and such thing, but sometimes it came from the therapist, like you would see in the miracle question. That's a hypothetical conditional that the therapist, him or herself, would provide. That would also likely be a presupposition.
And I think the only thing that I would add about conditional presuppositions is that this wasn't one that we originally kind of identified. Usually when we're doing microanalysis research, you think that you have some categories and you start looking for things, and then you run into trouble and you start finding things that don't fit into one of the categories that you've already described. And so it starts to mess up all of the reliability that you're trying to get. And so usually when that happens, then you start to discover that perhaps there's something else there that you haven't considered yet. And that's one of the things that happened with conditional presuppositions, is that we had those three previous categories of directing, redirecting, and continuous. And then we ran into this thing where all of a sudden, all these therapists kept saying, well, if this happened, what would you answer then? And it would throw off how we would analyze those utterances or those presuppositions. And so we then had to add this as a subsequent category and go back to the beginning and look at all of them again and say, do any of those that we've already done fit this conditional category? So again, I think that kind of just shows the inductive process that you go through in this research. So I want to also just point out that what we found and what we were looking for isn't necessarily exhaustive, right? That if somebody else went to these same sessions and they were looking at presuppositions, they might find something different than what we found or additional to what we found. So we're in no way saying that we have captured the market on presuppositions or we know everything there is to know about presuppositions. What we are saying is we've identified some things, but if we looked again or if we asked a different question, we might find additional information as well.
I think the most important thing that, or maybe one of the most important things that we found too, is how relevant they can be. So even though, like you said, this isn't as exhaustive, it still kind of opened up a window of an area that we can start to try to saturate with more understanding. You're probably also starting to imagine how much time all this takes to have to do this. It did take quite a lot of time. I think this was maybe the very first thing I started working on with you, Adam. So,
yeah, I think so far this project has taken, I think it's at least 4 years to do. So it's a lot of really tedious, boring, very slow video watching. So
yeah, you can go to the next one.
Okay.
So like Adam said, when we started out, we were just plainly looking at and observing presuppositions, trying to understand those more and see what was happening. And then later on is when we introduced Mark's paper, and we were just really fascinated by some of the things that we thought they could start to both speak to. If you haven't read his paper, or maybe if you just need a refresher, Mark McCurgo started to outline some differences he saw in how solution focus was originally being presented and how it is more recently. And he thought they were distinct enough that he could delineate a difference between them, giving them the names 1.0 and 2.0. And a few of those differences that he highlighted really caught our attention. Like he said that 1.0 is more action-oriented, it's more about doing. The questions tend to ask about, what would you be doing, or something more active rather than just descriptions. Would be more likely you would hear, what would you notice, in some of the 2.0 kind of sessions. He also kind of acknowledged that the 1.0 session is a little bit more still predicated on a problem pattern, since you're trying to change that pattern, you're trying to disrupt that. So it still is dependent on that, when a 2.0 session is much more likely to just be a description of what they want, what your preferred outcome. Oh, it's cool to see Mark is here, giving his input in the chat. I think that was all I was. Oh, and what the way that intersected with our presuppositional work is we started to see that the differences in how 1.0, the differences in how some of the earlier clinicians and the newer clinicians were using presuppositions started to line up with some of the differences that we saw Mark highlight. And that is kind of where more of our interest started to even peak. As Adam will show you in the next couple of charts that kind of delineate some of those differences statistically.
Okay, so I'm gonna say one thing about this slide as well. So one of the things that I want to highlight before the next 3 sets of slides are the results. So I'll try to walk through those results as clearly as I can. But one of the things I want to say before we move on to the results is that we aren't saying that what we've discovered proves that what Mark wrote is true or not true. Remember, we're looking at one linguistic tool, right? There are lots of things that we could have looked at. There are other microanalysis studies about questions, about formulations, about grounding, so there's other components of things that are going on here. So this is one piece of evidence that can be used in a grand scheme of things. And so I think in some sense, I hope that what this also does is that it inspires other people to also look at these things to say, can we find bits of information that will help us to understand this better going forward? But I do think that what we have found is very useful. And so I'll do my best. Before we move on to the results and what we've kind of found, do you have any questions about just that background information about presuppositions or things like that that we need to clarify or help you understand before we move on? Alan, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Adam and Cecil, great so far. You were talking about microanalysis. So you were using video, but what you've given us so far is very much the linguistic. We haven't had the all the visual elements of the presuppositional questions. How did you bring that in, or are you going to get to that?
Yeah, so we don't have time in this short segment to show you video. But what happens is everything is transcribed in exactly word for word. And then that transcription also has kind of analysis background. In addition to that, we have a manual of how do you analyze these things, which we had to develop. So we watched 2 videos in order to develop, again, inductively that manual. That manual is about 50 pages long. So that tells you how to analyze everything that you're going to do. Then you watch these videos, 2 people. We should also mention another woman, Paula Lang, was instrumental in this research. She helped. She and Cecil did the bulk of the analysis. They would watch those videos in 10-minute increments, and they would analyze 10 minutes at a time for one tiny little component. So they would say, does this utterance have a presupposition? Yes or no? And then we would compare their results. And then they would go back and watch the entire thing again, and they would underline the words that made up the presupposition. And we would literally count every word. Did they agree on each of the words in the utterance? And then we would calculate reliability again. So that's why it took us 4 years to do that, because they watched 6 full sessions in micro detail, at least 5 times each. And they were analyzing and underlining and all of that. So I can show you the transcript if you want to see the transcript and what that looks like. But they use.
My question is really, Adam, about, and you keep talking about what they said and the questions.
Yep.
what did video add that you couldn't have just done this with an audio?
Yeah, so you do take into consideration intonation, body language, facial expressions in order to understand the language. So you're not necessarily analyzing those things, but you're using those things to inform your decision about the language. So microanalysis is a language-oriented analysis, but you use the context of the rest of it in order to inform your decisions.
Okay, cheers.
Yep.
Yeah, there were times where the transcript made it seem like there was a question, and so we needed to analyze that. But then when we looked closely at the video and took in all that context in, like Adam said, we decided a few times that what looked like was maybe a question was actually not a question at all. Maybe it was a formulation or just the clinician, starting a sentence and rambling a bit and not quite asking something.
Yeah, great question. All right, so let me jump in and I'll show you these results. Don't get overwhelmed by this table at the beginning. I'll try to walk you through. So this is the general results, right? So you can see on that left-hand column, you see what we've considered 1.0 therapists: Steve DeShazer, Insoo Kimberg, and Yvonne Dolan. And then you see at the bottom half, you see Chris Iveson, Evan George, and Elliot Connie. And we considered those 2.0 therapists based on kind of the qualifications that Mark laid out in his paper. The second column is how many times they spoke. Each speaking turn is what we call an utterance, right? So an utterance can be one word. The client or the therapist could say, yep, and that's considered an utterance. Or an utterance could be an entire paragraph. So the utterances don't tell you much, except for it tells you how many times did the therapist speak. And they can see there that the 1.0 therapists and the sessions were about equivalent in time. They were all full sessions. Normally they averaged at about 40 minutes total. So you can see that 1.0 therapists spoke far less than 2.0 therapists. Just on the surface level, that means that the 1.0 therapists use more words and therefore take more time than the 2.0 therapists. 2.0 therapists, if you look at their utterances, they tend to be quite short, with the exception of Evan, who you can see was much lower than Chris or Elliot. Steve's client, you can see he didn't speak much. Steve's client spoke a lot. So her utterances were quite long, which then also takes time and leaves him less time to speak. So that's what that second column means. So then the third column is, of this second column, of the 82 times that Steve spoke, how many times did he include a presupposition? And he had 19 of his 82 times he included a presupposition. And then this number in parentheses tells you what % of his total utterances included presuppositions. Now, this you can see is significantly different. 1.0 therapists combined utilized presuppositions about 1 in every 5 utterances. Whereas 2.0 therapists use presuppositions about 1 in 2 times. So half the time, 2.0 therapists include presuppositions in their questions. One outlier here again is Evan. Evan tends not to use as many presuppositions. You can see that Chris and Elliot are dramatically more than most of the others. So then this fourth column is how many of the total presuppositions do not include presuppositions, and again, what %. So if we've done the math correct, these two columns should equal this column, right? And then these next 4 columns tell you of the presuppositions. So of this column here, how many of them fell into each of those different kinds of presuppositions. And you can see if we look at directing presuppositions, 1.0 therapists are about 10% of their total. So this is not 10% of the total utterances. This is 10% of the total presuppositions, right? So 1.0 therapists, about 10% of their presuppositions are directing, and also about 10% for 2.0. So they don't differ much in directing. Redirecting, 3% to about 5%, and continuous, about 87% to 85%. So where we had originally thought we were going to find differences in the kinds of presuppositions that they were using, we didn't really find much of a difference. We saw that 2.0 therapists use presuppositions a lot more, but the proportions of types don't really vary much. Until we got to this final column, which is that conditional category. You can see that 1.0 therapists, only 25% of the time are they using conditional presuppositions, but 81% of the time do 2.0 therapists use conditional presuppositions, right? And something really important to note is that Insoo didn't use any. And so that is something really significant. There's something really different going on. So what does that mean? One of the things that I want to highlight, and this will go back to what Mark laid out, right? This is one piece of the difference between action-oriented and description-oriented. The conditional presuppositions, if you go back to that definition, one of the things that we said, and again, remember, this is one that we didn't originally consider, but it was based on those hypothetical situations where they would say, if this thing were happening, what would your answer be? And 2.0 therapists, they have built their entire methodology on the desired outcome, their best hopes being present. And so they'll say over and over and over and over again. So if on your miracle day, or if your best hopes happened, or and they ask that again and again and again, and everything links back to a description of the desired outcome. And so because they do that, that condition of the best hopes being present shows up over and over and over again. And 1.0 therapists don't do that as much, or at least that's what we noticed, is that they don't ask that. They would ask some questions that were, if this happened, right? So Yvonne, you look at Yvonne, she was higher than the other 1.0 therapists. She was talking to somebody who was recovering from drug use. And so periodically she would say, what else would you notice if you were clean, right? And so she, because of the content of what she was talking about, it would come up often. But you can see here, and one thing I really want to highlight is you look at Elliot's numbers here. Almost 90% of his presuppositions are conditional. And you can see, and I think one of the things, and if you're interested, you can come and we'll talk about it later, but that diamond approach that we've talked about, we talked about 3 components, right? Get the desired outcome, describe the desired outcome, and then conclude the session. You can see that if 90% of his presuppositions are about the presence of the desired outcome, he's doing a description of that desired outcome the majority of the session. So again, these 3 types, we didn't really notice much difference, but there is something significantly different here. And I would say it does support what Mark laid out, that description is happening, and we can see that through hypothetical presuppositions, these conditional presuppositions. So I just want to pause there. I did see Vinay's hand go up. Vinay, do you have a question?
Yes, Adam. So, I mean, the numbers are like north and south, especially like Insoo has even a 0. So what has dramatically changed? Like you did mention about the action-oriented versus description-oriented. But what else? What else is contributing to such difference in numbers? 1.0 and 2.0, what has really changed? I mean, because I'm way young, I've never seen the 1.0 work. So what has changed?
So I want to just remind you, this is just one component, right? That presuppositions are a small segment of what happens in a solution-focused session. But I think even thinking, going back, I don't know if you were here when Eve Lipchick was just talking about kind of the development and those kinds of things, but she talked about that much of what was happening at the beginning of this is that the people behind the mirror and even the therapist, they viewed their role as somebody, as a team, that they would come up with an intervention, right? They would listen, and the goal was, we want to come up with something that's useful that we can tell them to go and do, and then they'll go and do it and change will occur. So if that's the goal, then building a description of the best hopes isn't going to happen, because we're going to find out as much as we can about exceptions or times when the problem isn't the problem. We're going to find out what you heard Eve talk about what they wanted to keep the same, right? Those kinds of things, I don't have to presuppose, right? I just say, what do you want to keep the same? There is a presupposition, or you want to keep things the same, but it's not conditional upon something happening. Whereas in 2.0, and again, kind of this description orientation that Mark points out, I have to lay out, if your best hopes occurs, what will you notice? Who else will notice? What will they notice? What difference will it make, right? All of those questions are contingent upon something being present. And so simply how we view our role in the room changed, and that therefore changed the language of what we're doing in the room.
Okay, and just to follow up, Adam, we are talking about the utterances that the therapists are making. Did you also, I mean, I don't know if it is relevant, but did you also factor in the utterances of the clients and how it impacted the therapists?
So we were particularly looking, because we were looking at presuppositions, that's highly dependent upon the therapist's questions. Where we did look at the client's response, and again, this took a lot of time and effort, but we had to look at, does the therapist pick up any of the words that the client used? So we had to go back, if we were on utterance, 400, we would have to look at all of the utterances that came before and say, did any of the language that they used in utterance 400, was it used previously? So really, we didn't analyze the client's language, except for to say, when did the therapist pick it up? All right, let me go on to the second one. If you have other questions, then hold on to them. But I just want to, so one of the other differences that Mark laid out in his paper is that 2.0 was much more interactional. And you heard Eve talk about this a little bit as well, that she said, don't lose track of the systemic factors here. So this was a tricky thing for us to do. But one of the things that we went back and we looked at each of the utterances and we said, which utterances contain references to other people, right? So oftentimes you'll say, who would be the first person to notice, or, right? And so then all of a sudden other people are connected to the situation. You can see again with 1.0 therapists, of their total utterances, 86 of their utterances, they included interactional statements. So they referenced other people and then interactions that would happen. This second column, and then obviously down here, it's 2.0 had 203, right? But again, don't be thrown off by those numbers that it's really different. Remember, 2.0 therapists had a lot more utterances than 1.0 therapists had, right? So in order to really get it, we have to come over here to the second column. So of these interactional statements, how many of them were included within presuppositions? 1.0 therapists included interactional statements in presuppositions 29% of the time, whereas 2.0 therapists included interactional statements in their presuppositions 62% of the time. And so again, just by looking at those numbers, you can see 2.0 therapists really are highlighting those interactions over and over and over. What would they notice, and would they be pleased by that? And right, and so that interaction that again Mark highlights as a hallmark of 2.0 therapy. You can see that we're seeing that almost 2/3 of the time they're including interactions within their presuppositions. This third column, I think, is really important, because one of the things that we did is we said, in Steve's session, how many different people were referenced in his session? And you can see that everyone, regardless of if they were 1.0 or 2.0 therapists, they included between 5 and 8. 1.0 therapists together talked about 18 different people, and 2.0 therapists referenced 19 different people. So by and large, they were almost equal in the number of people they talked about. Where it came to the difference was how often or how much of the time they spend talking about those people. And 2.0 therapists tend to talk about them much more, by and large. Now, again, I'll point out one interesting thing here is that Yvonne talked about other people quite a bit. And one of the reasons for this is that the client spent a lot of time talking about a previous boyfriend. And so many of the questions were, how much interaction would you have with him? And if you did this, would he still be part of the picture? And those kinds of things. And so again, the content of it made hers go up more. But even with that elevation, they're significantly lower as a group than they are as the 2.0. And Evan, much lower than, again, Chris or Elliot. And by and large, that was because this guy who he was talking to was talking about, he was out of work. And so he spent a lot of time alone. And so again, kind of the content of the conversation, there were less people to involve because he spent a lot of time alone. So again, this I think also supports what Mark laid out, that 2.0 therapists include a lot of interactional language in their conversations with clients. And so I think that's significant. And then the last last slide here, this is this action orientation, right? He talked about how 1.0 therapists are much more action oriented than 2.0 therapists. We already talked about kind of the flip side of that was description oriented, and we talked a little bit about that. Here, we went back through each of the utterances with presuppositions in them, and we said how many of the presuppositions include words that are action-oriented words, like I would do, or I would say, or I would, right? And so we then highlighted that. You can see here that as a group, about a quarter of the presuppositions that 1.0 therapists use included action-oriented language. The most common by far was doing. I would do, or what would you do? What would you do next? How would you do that? And then 2.0 therapists were much lower, only about 8% of the time did they include action-oriented language. One exception here that I want to point out is Elliot. And in his session, he was talking to a woman, and she would answer many of the questions. She was herself an action-oriented person. So he would ask a question like, what would you notice? And she would say, I would do more exercise. And so he would then ask the question that followed that language and would pick that up. And so the client introduced most of the action-oriented language for him. If she had not, my guess is he probably would have been much lower, because he doesn't tend to ask those questions unless prompted by the client first. But these others, they do tend to say, once they kind of get to a natural kind of conclusion of one part of the session, they'll say, what would you do next, right? And so that action orientation is perpetuated more by the therapists in these sessions than in these. So the conclusion, I think, from here is, again, that there's support in presuppositions for much of what Mark laid out, that 1.0 therapists tend to be more action oriented. 2.0 therapists tend to be much more description oriented. And again, I think this is probably the most significant finding, is that the description orientation is 80% of presuppositions versus 25% of presuppositions. So that's what we know right now. That's pretty much all we have time to go into. That, again, we could talk about it for all day, but we have a few more minutes. Do you have any other questions that we need to make sure to get to?
Let me just first of all say, wow, that's just unbelievable. I'm sitting here nearly in tears with the detail and the care you have taken over this. So I'm just blown away. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you.
Well, I had an initial conversation with Peter de Jong where we did a very informal exercise where he took an INSU session and I took a Chris Iveson session, and we kind of looked at them both without doing all the rigorous stuff that you've done. And he concluded that they were different. So in a way, you know, this is all building the thing. And to the question about, so the point of my paper was saying these are two different things, and you seem to be broadly confirming that. But it's only once we've confirmed that they are two different things can we investigate, to the previous point, the effectiveness thing. And I don't know. My hunch is that it is a little bit more effective, but we don't know. But the other thing that I laid out in my book, The Next Generation of Solution Focused Practice, is that this whole picture of description building can also tie into a kind of friendly explanation story about why this works at all, which I think also offers other benefits, if you like, as we go forward. And the real thing about, you know, the behavioral change thing, the MRI came up with that. A behavioral change now can resolve your thing or can move you forward. That was an MRI thing, and that in a way is the most revolutionary of the lot, because it got away from, you have to sort out your past, some causation in your past before you can move forward. And so we should also acknowledge the MRI folk for their, you know, their real contributions as well. But just thank you. It's been a marvelous session, and I'm looking forward to reading more about it and seeing how we can go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think one important thing to note too about what Mark just said, he does have a book that followed up on this. We didn't utilize the book because, again, we started this process about 4 years ago, and the book didn't exist then. Only the paper existed then. So we were too far along to switch to the book by the time it came out. So all right, I think we have time for one more question.
Looks like Vinay is physically raising his hand. I don't know if you see him.
Yeah, go ahead, Vinay.
A quick question. So did you take into consideration only the first sessions that the therapist did, or also the follow-up sessions?
We only did first sessions, and that's because most of these, they don't have second sessions recorded. So it was impossible for us to do that. In addition, we wanted to make sure that we were comparing as equally as possible. And so that's why we stuck with all first sessions rather than having a variety of sessions that happened at different times.
Really quick, I think Pout had a question about how some of the percentages of the different types of presuppositions add up to over 100. Maybe we forgot to mention, but it could be conditional as well as some of the others. You could be a directing, or a continuous and conditional presupposition.
Yeah, let me just pull that up. Yeah, good point. So these three categories, directing, redirecting, and continuous, they should add up to 100. But any of those could also be conditional. And so they were kind of two different categories. We analyzed those independent of one another. The first time through, we were looking for directing, redirecting, and continuous. And then we went back and looked at all of the same presuppositions again and said, in addition, are they conditional or not conditional? Okay, well, thank you for joining us on this whirlwind tour of presuppositions. I hope that it was helpful for you. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We have clearly nerded out way more than probably we should have on this, but nonetheless we have. But I think one final thing that I would say is I think all of this, in essence, supports there is an evolution going on. And as a field, we probably should begin to talk about, acknowledge, and try to figure out what does that mean? What do we want to do with that? Anyway, that's one small piece of evidence to show that some things are changing. Thank you very much.